Welcome to the relay. We're covering today's top boxing news.
Okay, we'll start with this. The latest from former champion Nina Hughes and what her intentions are in 2025 via her Instagram, saying, 2024, I had my world title taken away from me. 2025, I'm gonna go get it back.
She's gonna have to go back to Australia to do it. Rumor has it the rematch between them is set to go down on the undercard of George Kambosos' Matchroom debut, and rumor has it it's supposed to be in Australia.
That's the rumor. But there's also that situation with George and Richardson Hitchens that George says he's already signed the contract to fight Richardson Hitchens, and that might go down in New York City. New York would be a more even terrain for Nina and Shenika, as Nina's from the UK, Shenika's from New Zealand.
New York is neutral.
It's a fluid situation because if this rematch is supposed to happen on George's undercard, which undercard are we talking about? What are we talking about? Are we talking about a fight in Australia or a fight in New York?
Shenika Johnson sports a professional record of 16 wins with 2 losses, no draws, 6 knockouts, having never been knocked out in 18 professional bouts and having been a champion at 2 weights, Super Bantam and currently Bantam, where she holds the WBA title.
She won it from Nina. She won it from Nina earlier this year, who sports professional record of 6 wins with 1 loss, no draws,
2 knockouts.
having never been knocked out in 7 professional bouts. You will notice that Shenika has a lot more fights and a lot more rounds in the bank than Nina, but she's also several years younger than Nina. Shenika's what, 29? Nina's 41 going on 42 in the new year. So you know what I'm about to say. I favor Shenika to win, whether it's in Australia or New York or just some other neutral location. I still favor the younger, fresher, and more experienced fighter to win the fight.
Bigger too.
Bigger in the sense that Shenika is a bit taller and a bit longer than Nina. So when I first saw Shenika, she had the look of a boxer. Let's say a boxer puncher, an athletic one, capable mid-range to inside and able to stay on her toes and move around. That's when I first saw her.
You can fight long range too, long distance.
I wasn't aware she could also swap that style out for pressure fighting. Good old mid-range to inside pressure fighting, like she did in the Nina Hughes fight. I didn't expect Shenika to be as aggressive, as come forward as she was. I expected her to box Nina Hughes up. She did the opposite. She mauled her and overpowered her.
This fight doesn't need a rematch to me.
Nina Hughes, the shorter, stumpier, stockier fighter of the two, and the much older fighter of the two, is a lot more limited in her approach. That's not saying that Nina isn't good. That's saying that she's limited to boxing mid-range to inside because of how small she is.
And she has to be aggressive and come forward because she ain't got the height and length to do anything else.
Not dissimilar from what you see in Isaac Cruz, that Isaac has to be a pressure fighter because he doesn't have the dimensions to be anything else. He has to be a close quarters guy. Similar logic applies to Nina.
So I expect the same thing to happen in a rematch that we saw in the first fight. I'm expecting Shenika to win a points decision.
Bit of a formality for the newly crowned and reigning champion Shenika Johnson, who was only able to get out there once this entire calendar year, that fight being the Nina Hughes fight in May. It's the only fight either of them had this entire calendar year, though not being as active as you should, I'd say, affects a 41-year-old fighter more than a 29-year-old fighter.
Shenika Johnson takes care of herself in between fights. If you follow her social media, if you follow her Instagram account, she seems a bit of a fitness nut.
Doesn't balloon in weight in between fights, regularly stays in the gym all year. She's in the gym all year.
She'll be ready.
And let's hope that 2025 proves to be a more productive year for Shenika Johnson, who I anticipate will successfully defend the WBA title, though will she go on to unify it afterwards? That's going to take more doing, i.e., that's going to take more money.
We'll see if anybody puts it up.
Elsewhere in the world of boxing, the WBA credits sanctioning fees and Saudi sponsorship for boost in finances. The World Boxing Association, what is the oldest alphabet organization in all of boxing, at its annual convention in Orlando, reported a successful year after staging more than 400 title fights in the last 12 months. The sanctioning body insists Such a high number represents great opportunities for boxers, with an inference that, without belts varying from world championships to nonsensical continental straps, boxers would struggle to progress. Critics of the alphabet groups may disagree, however, and refer to such a high number of title fights, averaging at a rate of more than one per day from the WBA alone, as
a blatant cash grab, particularly if one considers the incredible number of belts available and then examines their true worth from a sporting sense. After all, logic should dictate that the more there are, the less valuable they become, unless you're in the business of charging for them.
Which the WBA is. WBA President Gilberto Mendoza stated that 67% of its gross annual revenue came from sanctioning fees alone. That equates to $4 million from the purses of fighters going to the WBA for the privilege of putting belts on the line. Sounds like an awful lot, and it is.
But you have to remember one thing. The fighters are the ones going along with this. That if you think it's unethical for the WBA to mass produce belts and trinket titles to then charge sanctioning fees for them, the boxers, their managers, and their promoters are the willing participants of this system. They don't have to be, but they are. The WBA's total annual revenue was approximately $6 million. Nonetheless, one could subsequently argue from a business perspective that the WBA is doing things the right way, because that $6 million bounty marks impressive year-on-year growth of around 100%. In 2023, the WBA declared $3 million in total revenue, which was slightly down from the $3.49 million recorded the year before. They're making more money. In essence, however, the WBA is all but admitting that without the increasing number of titles being churned out, their business would collapse. Therefore, asking the WBA to reduce the number of championships is akin to trying to persuade Ronald McDonald to stop selling any burger other than the Big Mac. The Oceanic title, for example, may not be to everyone's taste, nor meaning anything to anyone bar those fighting for it, but the WBA can justify its value, financially speaking. Because somebody paid them for it. The organization, founded in 1921 as the National Boxing Association, will in turn seek to persuade any naysayers that the money from sanctioning fees is for the good of the sport, and at their convention there was evidence of a company and leader in the form of Mendoza that's working hard to improve aspects of the sport while keeping the boxers at the forefront of their priorities. Extensive medical research to enhance safety is a key part of the business. Discussions about improving the image of the sport were fruitful, and there was genuinely impressive education of officials in charge of important decisions. There is also the usual charitable expenditure that any successful business will shout about while working hard to balance the books. Might all sound like a bunch of hot air to me and you, and maybe it is, but never forget, it's the fighters, their managers, and the promoters that go along with all of this. So now you're asking yourself why? If these trinket titles that the WBA mass produces are of little to no value, why are they paying for them? Well, the fighters want to be able to call themselves champions of some kind. The WBA makes it easier for them to do that. Their promoters want to be able to bill these fights as title fights, and technically they are trinket titles, but there was transparency surrounding Mendoza's official annual compensation of $600,000 before revealing their on-record profit for the year as $1.32 million. And that's not counting whatever they're paid under the table, because there is a table and there is something under it. That profit was unquestionably assisted by the sponsorship injection of Riyadh Season of a little under $500,000. That relationship with Saudi and Turkey Al-Sheikh Mendoza was at pains to stress must continue. One might conclude, however, that if heads of sanctioning bodies are bending over backwards to please the most influential figures for financial gain, their ability to govern is at best compromised. What Mendoza didn't say, but is worth pointing out, is how that money from the Middle East is essentially at the top of their profit funnel for every sanctioning body, whether they choose to accept sponsorship money from Al-Sheikh or not. Those sanctioning fees, a set percentage of a boxer's purse, whether that boxer is earning $10,000 or $10 million,
vary from fight to fight, even if the work carried out by the organization is exactly the same. So for as long as the Saudis are paying exorbitant wages and encouraging the alphabet groups to decorate their events with titles, the more those groups will earn in fees.
The disconnect here is thinking that the sanctioning bodies govern boxing. They don't.
Now, they might dictate to a champion who his mandatory challenger is and within what time frame he has to satisfy that mandatory, but that really is the extent of their power, and that in and of itself is still something the fighter has to go along with. They can choose not to.
You can order a champion to fight a mandatory, order two guys in your ranks to fight in an eliminator. Ultimately, they still have to choose to do that, and sometimes they don't.
Should be understandable then why Al Sheikh was treated like something of a messiah throughout the event, even though he did not attend. Impossible to justify are the methods employed to compile rankings and, in turn, the making of said title fights. Across two separate 3-hour meetings within the convention, fighters and or their representatives were invited to ask for higher rankings and or title opportunities.
This is what I'm telling you. It's the fighters and the teams that go along with this.
On multiple occasions, fighting for a WBA Continental title and therefore being a good ambassador for the WBA was put forth as justification for a world title shot or significantly higher rating. Not divulged was exactly how much they'd paid the WBA to participate in those Continental title fights. To his credit, Mendoza admitted in a conversation with Boxing Scene's Lance Pugmire that the current ranking process needs to change. Not so admirable was his admission that they will only reward fighters who outwardly want to fight for WBA titles.
Squeaky wheel gets the grease!
That's what they say. The relationship between fighters and these sanctioning bodies is a symbiotic relationship.
You scratch my back and I scratch yours.
Dots don't need to be joined to recognize that also means that they only reward fighters who pay them for the privilege. A good starting point when seeking to change the system would be deciding of ranking placements with form and performance as the only metrics. After all, every sanctioning body is surely privy to the same fight results that should provide all the evidence required to compile a set of rankings. Asking a fighter, manager, or promoter to make their case for inclusion or betterment, particularly after charging them money to contest titles, only provides fuel for accusations of improper conduct from those compiling the rankings. None of this is exclusive to the WBA, of course. Each of the rankings of rival bodies, IBF, WBC, and WBO, also include blatant favoritism to boxers who are or will be open to paying them sanctioning fees.
Under normal circumstances, the sanctioning fees come from the fighters, that money comes from the promoters, and the promoters get that money from the networks.
What has changed in the last calendar year is Saudi's entry into the boxing sphere and whatever their interests are.
You hear that at the WBA's convention, they were talking about Turkey like he's the Messiah. That's a good thing.
What?
Because we know what Turkey's interests are. What kind of fights they're willing to pay for. What kind of fights they want to make.
The dichotomy is slightly different because it's less about a network and a promoter protecting their assets,
more about making the best fight possible, the best matchup.
So even though it's painfully obvious that the WBA is only acting in their own best interests, the same as the other sanctioning bodies, all they're after is money.
Because the Saudis are now injecting so much of it into boxing, that gives them priority, that gives them influence, and what they want to do is make the best fights.
That's not a bad thing.
Many of these alphabet organizations are tantamount to parasites. I'm not saying that they're not, but they're not the ones in control. It's the ones with the money that govern boxing.
All these alphabet organizations can do is hope to get a piece, and to get a piece, you've got to play ball.
Kiss the rings, bitch.
Their practices are only really as dubious as the intentions of those who are paying them. In men's light heavyweight news ahead of their upcoming rematch, Dmitry Bivol said, "It's about being more comfortable in the ring with this guy in the second fight. I think it'll be a more open fight. I cannot find excuses. If he's saying that he needs to be more comfortable in the second fight, that means he must have been uncomfortable in the first one. And that's the way I saw it. That's what I saw. That whenever Dmitry would get something going, Artur's response and his thudding power would stifle his momentum. It's not that Dmitry Bivol wasn't landing punches. He landed many of them, but they were not having the effect on Artur that Artur's punches were having on him.
So let's say Dmitry Bivol just can't figure this guy out in the second fight. He just doesn't have the answers. What then?
Certainly doesn't have to be the end of Dmitry Bivol's boxing career if he can't make it past this guy, because this guy, if he wins again, he may not stay at light heavyweight much longer. The only fight that I could think of that might keep Artur there if he wins again is the David Benavidez fight for big money.
But at the very most, that's one fight. And that's if that one fight happens. You guys know how I feel. I don't think David's gonna fight the winner of that fight.
I think after the David Morrell fight that is set to take place in early February, don't be surprised to hear that David suffered some kind of an injury, something that's going to keep him on the bench for most of next year. Don't be surprised, and that's if he even wins.
Because he might not.
So, in a scenario where Artur Beterbiev beats Dmitry Bivol for a second time, the next highest ranked contender is not otherwise available. What's stopping Artur from moving up to cruiserweight? Alberto Ramirez moved up to cruiserweight.
The conversation could change dramatically. Might turn into Artur Beterbiev versus Zerto Ramirez for Zerto's 2 belts, or Jayo Pataya.
You remember a couple of months ago, before Dmitry and Artur fought, there was a conversation about putting Dmitry Bivol in there with Jai Opataya. Dmitry's focus was becoming undisputed champion first. He didn't get to do that.
If Artur beats him again, David Benavidez is not available. Who's to say they don't push to make Artur Beterbiev versus Jai Opataya?
That's if Artur wins. If Artur loses and they're 1-1 with each other,
Trilogy.
I entertain the possibility of a trilogy between them because I'm convinced David Benavidez is not going to fight the winner of that fight. He's not going to fight the loser of that fight, much less the winner. So in a situation where Dmitry avenges the loss, he becomes undisputed champion and David is not available, they might do a third fight.
Depending on the aesthetic of the second. If the second proves better than the first,
They might do a third, and you never know. Dmitry's talking about being more comfortable in the ring with Artur Beterbiev. What I think he means is more comfortable letting his hands go, punching more, and moving less. Because a lot of that movement,
you could interpret that as retreating. You could interpret that as Artur Beterbiev being on the better end of the exchange and pushing Dmitry back.
there are more moments where Dmitry's the one on the ropes or Dmitry's the one on the move than Artur. There are many more moments like that, and one way you could interpret it is that Artur was the ring general, pushing this guy around. So if what he wants to do now is move less and let his hands go more, get more comfortable with Artur Beterbiev, you know that's that many more opportunities that Artur might take him out. Because that movement is what kept Dmitry in the fight.
To make it into the next round. Moving.
Trying to put distance between himself and Artur. If you're gonna do less of that in the rematch,
Might get knocked out.